Hello, and welcome to The Source Within with Chloe Petalino, where I share the source within me with hopes it sparks the source within thee. I am joined today with my mother, Emilie, who I've asked to join me to talk more about the history, as she is an incredibly well-read and intelligent woman who has a vast knowledge base off the top of her head. And I would consider her quite the crone, which, Mom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Emilie, and I'm glad to be with you here today.
And can you describe for what a crone is?
A crone is a sage, wise, elderly woman.
Woman figure, correct?
Yes.
Yes, indeed. So my mother, a crone, is joining us today, and I'm so glad to have her here. And today we're going to talk about the time around when Jesus lived up until essentially the modern day. We're going to take a look at and examine what we, as in the general population, have considered to be truths for the past 2,000 years. However, more so, we're going to take a look at what is actually fact versus what has been myth and what we have told that may not be the truth over time. And we're going to examine what of those truths or myths have been intentionally kept from our view. Now, the point is not to start a blame game or point fingers. I do not want to fight previous persecution by reading more of it in any way. Simply, it is important, and I believe that everybody deserves to know and have access to more of the factual history of events that have led us to where we are today, and to understand what of those beliefs have been handed down and ingrained in us intentionally to mislead us in some ways versus those that we are going to relearn about throughout this podcast and that we may decide to ongoing believe in as truths for ourselves. So what are we really talking about? What is this information? So we'll start with, and really you brought it up to me, Mom, was the Library of Alexandria. And from what I've found, that was started in 3rd century BC, before Christ. And it was actually during a time when Egypt was being ruled by a Greek speaking dynasty at the time, is my understanding. So I think 3rd century BC is when the Library of Alexandria actually was built. And it was the single greatest accumulation of human knowledge and history that we have ever had in history. In fact, I mean, at the time there was no paper. The only way to write was on papyrus. And it's been said that there are between 4 and 400,000, or there were between 4 and 400,000 papyrus scrolls, to the point where the library they had created was so large that they had to create a separate one called the Temple of Serapis, which was nearby. So, what do you think was actually in that library?
Well, I think that you have to understand the history of mystery schools. Mystery schools in ancient Egypt offered a niche for the preservation of ancient religious ritual. And so it became more and more in demand as governments become more and more repressive.
What became more in demand?
The esoteric knowledge. So the origins of the Egyptian mystery schools are difficult to pinpoint. They were intentionally shrouded in secrecy. Some evidence suggests that they may have emerged during the Old Kingdom, which was a couple thousand years before Jesus lived. And that's the time that the ancient Egyptian civilization was at its height. And the mystery schools focused on understanding the universe through studying ancient spiritual texts and practices. So when you think about that, that's pretty amazing, because we're talking about, a civilization that flourished 4,000 years ago, yet mystery schools were dedicated to preserve these, the ancient beliefs, and they had a closed society. Initiation and membership wasn't open to everyone, and there was arduous study and training that was required. But the Egyptians weren't the only ones who had mystery schools. The Greeks had mystery schools, several different types, and this is all happening during the prehistoric era, like around 2000 BC. And
Okay.
so the goal of a mystery school is to present the core concepts of universal wisdom, and the teacher is like a gardener planting seeds, and the student then contemplates them. And so all there was already a huge body of knowledge that was already being hidden or contained. And this knowledge was hidden because it really held the key to the power of the universe. Some felt that the average person wasn't equipped to handle that knowledge, and that misuse of the knowledge could be destructive. For example, even more ancient Atlantis, which is, some consider that a myth, and others consider it that there's significant evidence that there was a civilization that um, became so corrupted uh, by knowledge and power that it turned on itself and ended in a great cataclysm. So,
Well, I think that there were two civilizations opposed. Yeah, that ended that one.
so other of the mystery schools leading up to, say, biblical times were for example, the Essenes lived um, in what is now in Palestine, what's now Israel. They lived in caves. They withdrew from civilization, and they had a very powerful set of knowledge. Some people say that that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus actually were part of that mystery school.
Okay. So, to phrase it in different ways, what I'm hearing is that essentially there were prior civilizations before Egypt. And what I would hypothesize is that we don't know a ton about those prior civilizations. One of which reasons might be, which we'll get to in a second, is essentially the destruction of the Library of Alexandria that held all of this information about our history and about prior civilizations. So we haven't quite gotten there yet. But so what I'm hearing is that yes, there were many civilizations prior to what we know as ancient Egypt that existed. Do we have all the information about it? No, likely because it was destroyed in the Library of Alexandria when that was burned multiple times. However, through time, the ancient teachings, so basically these were very advanced cultures who had an understanding of how the universe functions, the laws, the principles of the universe, how to tap into those to create the societies and civilizations and the lives that they wanted on earth. And then essentially through time, those secrets and universal laws, principles, and more than that was passed down verbally through, maybe, I don't know, verbally and written, but through these what were called mystery schools, which were essentially initiatory schools, I suppose, who taught people basically spiritual development in many ways and how to master many of the rules of the universe. So is that kind of what you're saying with how the mystery schools, and then we fast forward
Yes.
to okay.
Hmm.
Okay, so then fast forwarding to, I guess maybe they weren't destructed at that time. I'm not sure. I'm not clear on this. I mean, you're saying that the ancient Egyptians were around 2000 BC.
Well,
The first,
even longer ago than that, but the mystery schools were started because there was already kind of a thought that people shouldn't have various knowledge in case it was misused,
that's right.
that the knowledge was power, that it was too powerful, um, and and so that knowledge was hidden away from people. So there already, even before the time of Christ, there was a history of knowledge being
Kept
kept
secret.
secret. And so there was the library in Alexandria existed and a lot of knowledge was lost then, but yet there were these other mystery traditions that still guarded some of that knowledge. And
Hmm.
so like the Essenes were an example. They guarded, they had, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in like the 1950s, and they were manuscripts that had been hidden in caves in the desert by the Essenes.
Mm. Right. So we'll get to that too, like the modern findings. Yeah.
And so whether there were, back then in ancient times, in those ancient times, it was considered that this knowledge could be dangerous if it was in the wrong hands.
Right.
Later on, after the time of Jesus, knowledge became suppressed because um, people's power was taken away, especially
Right.
women's power by the early church.
Right. Well, I mean, I think yes, that there was secrecy about the teachings earlier on, but I feel like how you said it was guarded. It was
Guarded.
more guarded. I feel
Yes.
like than necessarily being withheld. It was
Yes.
because some of the teachings really are so powerful that when humanity realizes the potential that we have, these godlike, the source, basically the source of God within us, when you get to achieve certain levels of it, it is so powerful that one must be careful about how they use it, essentially use these abilities. And so
Yes.
you had to kind of earn over time, I would imagine, like demonstrate that you would use these powers in a safe, you know,
And
a
through
pro-social way, I
and
guess.
through spiritual practice,
Right. And
more
development.
more and more would be revealed.
Right. That they would by doing their own spiritual growth and work, they would come around to understanding more and more of this it's more sacred wisdom rather than
Yes.
just secret. I feel like back in the
Yes.
mystery school days, it was more considered sacred and more considered guarded, just rather than secret. Just to clarify those two things. Okay, so fast forwarding, let's finishing up with this with the. I mean, should we? Are we at the point to talk about the library and how the library got destroyed?
Sure, go ahead.
Because okay, because so essentially, the Library of Alexandria, again, that held a lot of this information from what we can understand. So the mystery school information and the information about our just civilization and our history was there. And essentially, it was first at 48 BC. Julius Caesar basically burned some of the library because he was burning a fleet of ships against the Egyptians, I think, and accidentally burned some of the library. I'm not sure. They don't know how much was destroyed in that fire. Then there was another one. The biggest one, I believe, was in 385 CE. So now would this be after Jesus?
Hmm.
Okay. That was burned by Theophilus, who was the Patriarch of Alexandria at the time. And 10% of all of the collection had been moved to this temple of Serapis that I had mentioned. But even that was then taken over by this Theophilus patriarch and then turned into a Christian church, and all of the teachings from there were also destroyed. So, and I think that kind of perpetuated this attack against the library, attack against the teachings from the library, and people started being tortured and killed, etc. Then, even farther later, the third time that it was destroyed was 640 in AD or CE, when Alexandria was under Muslim rule by Caliph Omar, who claimed that the contents of the library were either, quote, contradictory to the Quran, which would be heresy, or whatever, I don't know, whatever they did agree with, that was superfluous, so they could get rid of it. And basically, okay, this is amazing. It took 6 months after it already all those documents or whatever had already been destroyed two times before, at least part of it had. The third time, it still took a total of 6 months for all of the material in that library to burn. Like, I don't know, that just, I think, demonstrates how much history came before that time that we really don't know about.
It it
in
was
some ways.
vast, and there were also there were also mystical orders like the Masons who
Hmm.
existed since Egyptian times.
Hmm.
And so the Masonic order was very symbolic. My father was a Mason, and Masons, can't share all of their knowledge with other people. But my father, when I was very young, had told me about the burning of the libraries of Alexandria and how that was a loss. So, you had the Masons, later on Rosicrucians, you have, Knights Templar. So there have been like kind of secret hermetic orders of people who also had knowledge. The
People
tone of
won't
it,
even know what hermetic means.
it means hidden. It means hidden.
Hermetic, really?
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Like a hermit. Hermit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, so you're saying that there were other mystery schools that occurred throughout
There
time. Certainly.
orders, mystery schools,
Yeah.
orders. Some of them existed before Christ. Some of them, continued on or were formed after Christ. But with the beginning of the Christian era, you had a different kind of repression of knowledge, really starting with Jesus himself. I mean, Jesus numerous times in the Bible, such as we know it, said, what I can do, you can do. And I am my father's house. There are many mansions in my father's house. Certain quotes that still remain in the Bible that really indicate that we also are divine and can also accomplish and achieve what he achieved. And so some traditions, rather than viewing Jesus as the only God, view him as one of many masters who ascended. And the Christian church doesn't really believe that. Their whole hierarchy and whole belief system was founded upon a person, whereas the other belief systems were founded on a body of knowledge.
Okay. What other beliefs? What do you? You're saying the other mystery schools,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
okay.
So those
Mm,
other traditions were based on knowledge, not centered around a person or a central figure.
mm-hmm. You're so okay. So you're saying basically they weren't centered around Jesus being the
Yes,
Christ, right? I mean,
yes.
being, although I believe
Well,
Christ means love,
the
really.
the Christ.
The
So
Christ,
the Christ. So many people believe that the Christ is a state that can be attained
right?
by anyone.
Which unconditional love is the
Not that
Christ.
it's easy, but
Okay.
it's a state that can be attained by anyone. And so some writings, like Alphonsus Levi, wrote the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. He was the Christ. He was a Christ. There are other Christs, but not necessarily called by that name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Basically, other beings who have reached, I mean, a level of Christ, which my understanding is that's unconditional love, is ultimately what
And oneness
that's
with God.
and one right. Well, in achieving that, I feel like yes, through that, then oneness with God. Yes, returning back to the God. Yes. So yes, those were some of the differences between, again, we have the mystery schools that have over time that were based on understandings and knowledge and and not philosophies. I mean, in fact, I believe off-planet people came and gave them that information from Atlantis, or well, came to Atlantis and eventually and gave the initial
Mm-hmm.
Atlanteans this information. That's I was how they obtained this information about their connectedness and their abilities to achieve these godlike or divine states or like Christ states. Okay, and then essentially we get to Jesus time. So I think maybe you could speak a little bit about how Jesus was either accepted or not accepted in what he was preaching during his times. Because I find it interesting,
Well,
I don't think he wasn't really totally accepted.
he
Here we like in our current age, in our current things, we're taught as though, oh yeah, just like Jesus was, the Christ and Savior, and kind of everyone knew that, but really that's not how it was when he was actually in
well he
existence.
was he had a group of followers,
Sure.
but the established church
Hmm.
which was Judaism at that time. The established church reviled him because he was preaching a message that was antithetical to theirs.
Hmm.
Their message was very bound by tradition, bound by scripture, bound by having to do certain rituals in certain ways to appease a God who was far off and away and was a punishing God. And Jesus's message was very different, that God is within you, that he and God were one. What I can
That
do,
God
you
is very
can do.
forgiving.
The forgiving God. And the other piece of it is that those religions, those like the Jewish religion, was very patriarchal. And so, in contrast to Egyptian civilizations before, where there were many great women who were rulers, so female power was also recognized. And
Yes.
but by the time, in Jesus's time, female power was not recognized by the organized religion, by the Sanhedrin and the priests of the temples, the rabbis. Women had a secondary place. Women weren't allowed to be priestesses, unlike some more ancient civilizations in ancient, in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. Within the Essenes, women were priestesses. Women did have power, but really that Jewish religion was very patriarchal, centered around the priests. Women couldn't serve in that role, and
Hmm.
um, and then in the early Christian church, there was like a repression of women. The whole dichotomy, Madonna and whore, started. And so a woman, those were the only two choices. There weren't any kind of shades of gray or in between. And prior, other civilizations, including some that existed simultaneously in the Americas, that people didn't know about, like the ancient Toltecs, women's power, women's sexuality, women's ability to be creators was celebrated. And so, really interesting. But in the early, in, after, and Jesus was put to death for having these beliefs that were unlike those that were prevalent at the time. And then, of course, the whole Christian church grew up around worshiping him as a martyr, and their belief as the risen Christ, the eternal. And yes, life is eternal. We all have the capacity to transcend death. We are all going to live eternally. There's no question about that. Having had a death experience in my life, I know that there is life beyond. And so immortal life is sure and guaranteed. The Christian church developed a whole belief system around there was only one way to get there, and that was to worship as Jesus did. Interestingly, there's a whole debate about the painting about the Last Supper and who was at the Last Supper. The Essenes actually had a tradition of blessing bread and wine. That was prevalent at the time. That the Last Supper, when Jesus blessed the bread and wine, he was actually carrying forth an Essene tradition.
I thought Abraham actually started that tradition,
Oh,
which Abraham I think probably wasn't a scene.
well, the whole
Hmm.
many of the people that have been carriers of wisdom have been part of the same tradition,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh,
Hmm. Right.
maybe interpreted a little bit differently.
Sure. Then that's true. We see that actually coming up in history in multiple places where there's similar stories and themes, such as like the 12, yeah,
And
12
so,
disciples of Jesus, also the 12 families of Atlantis.
so the early Christian church, in its departure from Judaism, carried that patriarchy even further. There were, some people think that some of the gospel writers, maybe Peter and Paul, were misogynistic. And there was the Council of Nicaea that happened in like 300 years after Jesus died, it was a whole council of kind of church elders that got together and decided what their message was going to be. One of the messages was that women were powerless, that women in their essential state of kind of raw femininity and raw sexuality was somehow bad. And at that time, any pictures of Mary were changed to show her in like blue and white as opposed to red. In some very ancient statues and icons, Mary is depicted much differently. And there were two Marys. There was Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, who came from the Essene tradition, and then there was Mary Magdalene, who receives very little recognition for her role. She was Jesus's number one most loved disciple, yet she was cast in the role of, of being a prostitute, and being bad, and kind of painted out of the Last Supper gathering
Mhm.
where she would have been present.
Okay, so I just want to clarify this. So Jesus was teaching these practices that we can go within, that everyone has the same abilities and capabilities that he did, etc., etc. Now, again, the church that ultimately the church that then reveres him at the time, or at least with the religion of the time, did not feel that way. They persecuted him, and it wasn't until after he rose that they then were like, "Oh, wait a second, he's
Well, well,
or what?"
well, not even then. Like
Okay.
the Romans ruled Palestine. And so initially, after Jesus died, and many of his followers, his apostles and others, were persecuted after he died and were martyred, Christianity itself was a mystery school at that
Mm.
time. At
Mm.
that time, it was a mystery school. Many of the people that were initially drawn, the early Christians, came from different pagan religions. And so the pagan religions, uh,
You're
pa-
saying the people that followed Christ,
yes, so
Jesus.
many of the people that were attracted to that early Christian movement came from pagan backgrounds. And so some of the early traditions that were folded all in together were like based on um, pagan festivals like the solstice. So
Mhm.
Jesus's birth, which some people don't believe was December 25th, some people believe that it was would have happened earlier in the spring. The solstice was celebrated as a pagan holiday, and so his birth was tied to that. And
Because the
then
solstice, because he was considered the sun,
yes,
the son of righteousness, in fact.
and some of the those original uh, traditions were an amalgamation between and at that time, these times when the church was first emerging, the Bible wasn't even written. The Bible
Right.
wasn't, there were various people that channeled or were given certain parts, certain stories. But in 300 AD, in the 300 years after Jesus died, these mystery schools kind of all came together, and the early kind of leaders of those movements decided what their message was going to be. And one of the messages was that women,
Wait, you're talking about the Council of Nicaea?
yes,
Okay. Okay. So they had at that time nothing was written. You're
there were
saying
some
you're
writings,
saying
but
you're not going.
they were
Okay.
brought together.
Right.
The various writings were brought together, and
Okay. So
then
like a prophet, or
and
someone like that.
yeah,
Like
and
we're talking about the what
they
comprised what created the Bible.
they picked the various authors, like the authors of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had
Mm,
their various anecdotes
right. So they wrote
that
their
they
own
told about.
versions.
Yes, and then it was then the overall message was decided in 300 AD
Well, we
by
don't.
this group of
Mhm.
people that would go forward, and then the Bible has had so many iterations since that time.
I guess my question is, was it established that what was the message was going to be, or rather, the point is that only what was included, essentially, only that was included were written by males. We know that's a fact, correct?
Yes.
This is let's talk about what the actual facts are, not what we're. So the facts are the only thing that were included in the Bible were writings from men. We also know that those weren't the only followers of Jesus, nor were they the only disciples of Jesus. We absolutely know that Mary Magdalene was one of those. So
Yes.
we can deduce that specifically it was intentionally chosen not to include anything written by a woman in the text in this Bible.
Yes.
Right? Okay. Okay. And then so that really did not start. It sounds like this patriarchy was somewhat in existence even before Jesus. However, this was after all of our history had been destroyed essentially in the Library of Alexandria. Now going forward, we were creating this new book that would quote unquote have our history in it, at least in that time, which was the Bible. And it was chosen specifically only to include male writings. That was one aspect of it. And to also paint the women that were included as
Tainted.
something right. Something was wrong with them. Yeah. As tainted. And you're saying as well that you think that there was an aspect of that because they were fearful of the power that women had.
Yes.
Right, right, right. Which I have said in previous episodes actually that the Sophia, the reptilian beings that came from off planet, one of the four different types, they chose women of all the humans on earth, women specifically, to give the knowledge of the universe, to give the alchemy, to teach the alchemy traditions, and to teach that. And that was women that were defined. So it could be that women actually had this innate knowledge from the beginning. Maybe there was some threat between men. I don't know. That then they wanted to turn against women over time. However, my understanding about how it even became affiliated that men or that women were associated with negative and men with positive was actually way before, and is when we were hunters and gatherers on Earth, and the men would go out and hunt during the day, and so then in the minds on our duality, since we put things into categories in our minds to help organize our systems and our environment around us, it was somehow affiliated that men were associated with the day, which we associated with being good, light with good, and women became associated with dark or night and darkness because women would practice, I guess, ceremonies and stuff during the moon and dark. However, humans, from a biological standpoint, at night were more likely to be killed because they would kill by animals they couldn't see. And so the original split between a positive association with men and negative association with women started from that biological standpoint. That's apparently is what I've come to understand by Matthias de Stefano. He remembers back prior lives and these sorts of things. Anyway, so then it became over time, and then here's this. So I guess what I'm saying is that yes, some sort of a patriarchy that then started taking hold in some larger way, and it became a power over, an oppressive over, then as women being second class citizens. Okay, so women were considered threats, and the patriarchy was in existence and then continuing. So they removed women from any mention in the Bible and removed Mary Magdalene's core role in really being fundamental to Jesus's ascension, ministry and ascension. Yes, and she also did a lot of the healing works.
And Mary, his mother, was also a healer in her own right.
She was. In fact, all three of them went to mystery schools.
Yes.
They all studied. They all were in mystery schools, actually. So I guess just to say here is that Jesus did not believe in this patriarchy. He did not. In fact, he believed in equality. And I think that's also what he was preaching, that the powers that be did not like at that time as well. Okay. I still don't know if I'm totally understanding how they turned to then like Jesus after he was persecuted.
Well, because there was that core group of followers that he had,
right?
And they went out and preached. The apostles went out who were his core group, went out and kept preaching his message,
Yeah.
and his message started to attract more and more people. And many of the people that it attracted were from like the pagan traditions. And that's why, Christianity incorporates some pagan traditions within its holidays and feast days and so on.
What do you mean by pagan tradition? Oh, you're talking about like the moon and the sun
Uh-huh. Yeah.
solstice and
Hmm.
these sorts of
Hmm.
things. Well, I don't know if Christianity does now anymore, but
Well, sure they do, and just in terms of when everything is celebrated. It's all celebrated around the astrology, uh, the movements of the planets, the moon, and so on, the lunar phases. Still today, those holidays. I mean, that's why
which
Easter is not on a fixed day. Easter is, I think, the second Sunday after the new moon. It's close. It's
oh,
close to
interesting.
it's close to the full moon after the new moon in Pisces. And so that was the Piscean era. Jesus is
Right.
viewed as the Piscean master. There's a lot of symbology about fishes
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
Pisces in his whole ministry. And so Easter, his rising, was the full moon, the full moon in Virgo.
Wow, okay. That we can talk. We can. Oh, yeah. Okay. The Aquarian age of Jesus, I would like to. We actually need to speak about in full. All right. So okay. Scooting along through history because now we're off. 300 AD, the Council of Nicaea again. So, what the confusion is that there's pagans. You're saying there's all these pagans who were okay with
Well,
all this
because
stuff,
yeah, because what
but then how did they? Where did the corruption come? Okay, so also in the Bible, aside from the women being written out, the other aspect was it shifted. I mean, it wasn't carried forward that we had this direct connection with God or
right,
that we had our own
that
abilities
you
or
had you
capabilities.
had to go through the church. You had to go through the church fathers. The church had to be an intermediary for you. You could no longer connect with God on your own. It had to all be through the church. And so then the corrupt practices of like selling indulgences and selling indulgences, selling pardons, essentially.
Oh, so like
um,
they would
so the
create
church
hell
father, like the pope, like, yeah, there was the whole mythology about heaven and hell, the whole
fallacy.
mythology about that only having one life and not living again, and you had to go through the church. You had to pay and so like the fathers of the church, the bishops and the cardinals and the early popes, many of them, they couldn't be married, but many of them fathered children out of wedlock. They weren't walking the walk, but yet they were profiting greatly. They were selling indulgences to peasants who were trained to believe that they needed to have that in order to advance to the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
And so the whole idea that everyone has an original sin, and the original sin was somehow based on, I don't know whether it was based on Adam and Eve or whether it was based on the fact that men, killed Jesus, but everybody supposedly has an original sin that has to be taken away from them. There was no belief anymore that that it's interesting, supposedly men are created in the image of God, but yet somehow they're also created with his original sin. So what is it? Do they have an original sin and they're sinners that have to be redeemed, or are they created in the image of God? And so those questions are kind of accepted in modern day Christianity. That paradox is not even addressed. So anyway, in the times that followed the Council of Nicaea, in the early days of the church became more and more powerful. They sold indulgences. Yet they recruited more and more believers, but they stamped out anything that was against them, and those were considered the Dark Ages. Like the Dark Ages, from the 500s, 600s on up to the Middle Ages. Science was reviled. Um, Knowledge was, well, there wasn't much science then, but knowledge was reviled, and people thrived. They were uneducated, and they thrived on the what they were taught in the church.
Well, they
That
didn't thrive.
that
They just didn't have
basically
a choice.
they were nothing, and the church was all powerful. So the church and the royals, so people, this whole system of kind of having intermediaries between you and God grew and grew. And those were dark times. People were ignorant, they were not healthy, diseases were rampant, the plagues happened, and that kind of persisted into the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages were kind of a middle point between those dark ages, those early days of the church, and the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. The Renaissance meaning rebirth. And so after the Middle Ages were relatively in between, and the Renaissance, you had the rebirth of knowledge. But even during the Renaissance, which was about the 1600s, that was only allowed to go so far. People were persecuted. You can take examples like, for example, Joan of Arc. She was about the 1400s, and Joan of Arc had tremendous knowledge. She clearly had a direct connection with God. God was speaking to her, angels were speaking to her. She led an army and was victorious for the French people. And then afterwards, she was reviled and feared for her knowledge, and she was burned at the stake.
Right. So I mean, it seems like essentially what I'm hearing is that first they wrote, I mean, it's interesting. I still don't know necessarily where the heaven and hell came from, or I guess it likely actually goes back to that positive and negative, men being associated with, well, us on, at some point, we as humanity associated the light with good and dark with bad. And there was also the association of, okay, light with the sun in the sky that occurred when it was light out was and somehow associated with heaven. So what is above is heaven. And then darkness, then they associated that with like lower, and what is below then or dark is evil. So they created this heaven and hell framework basically then to profit off of it by selling these pardons or whatever it is, because people genuinely believed if they did not do X, Y, and Z, or, pay the tariffs or whatever it was, then they would not go to heaven. So essentially, from the very beginning, fear was used to instill in the people fear in order to control people and the narrative on a larger scale. So fear was used quite early on and to get people in control. And so fear by what they taught, also not allowing access to any other modality. So what I'm also hearing is through the dark ages, and I have to wonder, through the dark ages when there was disease and famine, especially when we think about this idea of law of attraction and this idea of like health and well-being of people, I have to wonder, was there so much disease and famine? I'm also thinking scarcity mindset that was probably instilled with them. Time of disease and illness to me also makes me think like that was a mentality and thinking around that time, and so they therefore attracted kind of this ill civilization because it was so focused on hell and damnation and focused on and based on fear basically. And it was people were controlled based on fear. And then so you had the removal of all of the prior history in the Library of Alexandria. Then you have the rewriting of basically history because they rewrote what they wanted to include in the Bible so that people would follow and to have control. And then when did so with the suppression of knowledge, then a manipulation of what the message was, the myths started to be told, the fallacies that are just completely not true, like this idea of heaven and hell, and that God was punishing, and that God, all these sorts of things, that God is male, all of these myths that have been woven throughout time. But then also they persecuted people that were right? I mean, this is when the mystery
Yes.
schools had to go underground.
Yes.
So there were still people, and there's still, have been lineages throughout time that have held the ancient belief systems, but they really, really had to go underground.
Right. The Knights Templar were an example.
Okay, we're an
They went
example of that.
underground, or they were all killed off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and then then you had the persecution. So we like around at the time of Joan of Arc, she was any women that had too much knowledge were suspected of being witches. Any women who seemed to have um, the gift of prophecy or the gift of clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, women who were wise and who knew,
Basically, demonstrated any knowledge,
were often burned at the stake. And so in
like
the
the
in the
oracles
time
or
in the
such.
time of the Spanish Inquisition, this started just before the Renaissance and then continued into Renaissance times. Even then, when art and knowledge and literature were celebrated, people who did not toe the line with the beliefs of the church were tortured, were imprisoned, were killed, and the more Catholic countries were really at the forefront of doing that in Europe. And but when discoveries were made, like Galileo, Copernicus, some of the scientists who were exploring things and who were giving alternative realities, like that the Earth is round. Prior to that, it was conventional wisdom that the Earth was flat, that all of the sun and everything revolved around the Earth, that the was a geocentric world. And when he proposed, no, there's a different way order of things, he was put under house arrest.
Mm.
And so that persecution of knowledge, that we're still seeing it today, right? There are certain people in our country who believe that science is wrong, that anything like that is wrong, and that science is reviled among those people. And so, again, in an effort to disempower that knowledge, and any of the great thinkers or the great creators throughout history were clearly open channels to the divine. Any of that knowledge that was coming in was coming from elsewhere, and they were expressing it. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it was appreciated, sometimes it was too scary for the average person. And so, they persecuted them, they locked them up, they put them under house arrest, they did those kinds of things. And then,
To really control the message. I mean, we've got to think about this. This is
yes,
again,
to
this is to
control the
maintain,
message.
this is to
Yes.
maintain control. So it's they didn't want any alternative messaging getting out. They didn't want that. They don't want it to get out that basically this stuff has been hidden, that they have
And the
manipulated and changed, and that they're continuing to teach and preach things that are that are just not true.
And the Protestant churches, then they were that's why what they're called, Protestant protest. They were protesting against the excesses of the Catholic Church,
Mm-hmm.
which was clearly corrupt. And they wanted to get back to a more natural type of religion. And then you had in England, the Church of England was started by Henry VIII because he wanted to be able to be allowed to divorce and have as many wives as he wanted. And so the Church of England started. And so there were other offshoots of religion, that of various Christian denominations, that wanted to be free to worship in the way that they wanted. They didn't want to go along with the Catholic Church. They didn't want to believe in the Pope. They didn't want to. And so you had the Protestant, the protests, and the Reformation. And then those people were the ones who came to America. They were Protestants. They were pilgrims. Um, they were Puritans because they wanted a more pure view of things. But the persecution then even accelerated more. The persecution, the prejudice against women happened even more in colonial America. And that's where you had, women being burned at the stake, and women really being relegated to roles that um, had no kind of no voice, really, no political power.
Hmm.
They were relegated to the role of, homemaker, housewife, baby maker, and that was considered their only role.
Well, the only role that would be socially acceptable, and I mean, not so long before that, the only roles, if they didn't weren't in line with the roles, they would be killed.
They would be burned at the stake,
That
as
is the thing.
which
Yes, if they did not conform, if you questioned anything, you literally were facing, you're risking your life, which is why this became so ingrained over time that people got in line. They didn't weren't able to question it over time, and if they wanted to, they would have been killed or murdered. So where have we come since then, even with the restriction of women?
well,
Is
the same thing is happening now. I mean, women have just recently been, taken away the right to choose, the right to have control over their own bodies, the right to health care with the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And now, even, one of the states has passed a ruling about IVF where, you know, even embryos are considered to be children and have more rights than women or the parents. Yet they only take that so far. If
Hey, y'all. So I was going back and re-listening to this episode, and in fact, I was going to take out this above section talking about what's going on currently with women's rights and access to healthcare, et cetera. And I was going to kind of take it out because I really don't want this to be focused in any way on politics. And it's because it's really not about that. I decided to leave it in because as a social worker, access to healthcare and equitable access to healthcare for all humans is important and a necessary requirement for all humans to have. So I'm leaving it in for that reason. And at the same time, the rebalance between this over masculine, the dominant patriarchy, etc., that is not going to persist. The feminine is rising, the divine feminine is certainly rising. And as Tracy Kumbara said on one of her recent podcast episodes, as the pendulum swings one way, as it has swung all the way to the full on patriarchy, the pendulum must swing back the other way. And so, the divine feminine is going to be rising and it's going to be returning. We will reach a place, the target is really a place of neutrality and balance. Additionally, the policies referred to in this episode were related to those that are happening in the US. Those are not applicable everywhere in the world. Different, countries have different rules, regulations, etc., regarding women. But when speaking about the return of the divine feminine, that is speaking on a global scale. That's something that's going to occur collectively, both individually as women step into their own, and as there are supportive divine masculine who are also stepping into their role to support the return of the divine feminine. But again, this is going to happen, like we're talking more planetary and globally. And I also want to acknowledge that this was a heady episode and could bring up a lot of feelings and intensity for some people. And for some people, it might bring up some rememberings of past lives or things like that, where they have felt like they've experienced persecution, or things like that could be showing up in your current life and you're wondering where it comes from because nothing in your current life matches up with this, a sense of feeling of persecution. So just wanted to offer, I have a couple videos on YouTube. One is a Shasta healing video where I send some energy from Mount Shasta, the root chakra, which has great maternal healing energy. And then I have another one that is about clearing out the debris and reprogramming. So just wanted to offer those for folks who might be interested in having some extra support around that. And thanks so much for joining myself and Emilie today. And I look forward to seeing you next time on The Source Within, where I share the source within me with hopes it sparks the source within thee. See you next time, y'all.